All right, we're going to start our first little triplet of terms here, beginning with focus, and then we're going to move on to balance, and then talk about shape. Now, focus is the one thing in the list that is kind of different than all the others because it's not so much of an element of design as it is the goal that we're trying to do. We want to bring the viewer's attention to the subject of our image, whatever it is. If it's a quick piece of concept art or if it's a fantastic oil painting that took 3 years to paint, right? There is some point of focus that our eye is eventually going to be drawn to. And that can be very simple and obvious, like in this photograph, where there's an actual optical focus. The lenses have been adjusted so that one thing is in focus and the other things are literally out of focus. But when we talk about live performance, a lighting designer for theater or opera or dance has to spend a lot of their time giving us focus through contrast or light. So a lighting designer will try to set up lights that evoke a mood, or they will kind of show the time of day, the conditions, weather conditions, that sort of thing. They want to try to replicate those things to give us an impression of where and when we are. But the main part of their job is guiding the audience's eye to what they should be looking at on stage. Because unlike in a composition where we can control it through the frame, or even in a film where there's a cinematographer directing a camera, live performance, the audience's eyes can go anywhere they want. So a lot of what a lighting designer does is make the thing that we should be looking at the brightest thing on stage. So using contrast, using the brightest thing on stage as the thing that we should be looking at. And our eyes are typically drawn to that in any kind of composition. The brightest thing in a composition, or the most saturated color, which is oftentimes the same thing, or the area of the greatest contrast. So here's a photograph that basically is exactly the opposite of what I just said. The subject of this photograph is almost entirely black. He's in silhouette there. But around the shape of the guy standing here on the railroad track is an area of very high contrast. So we go right from the very bright white sky there up by his hat immediately into the silhouette, and he's almost completely in the dark. You see a little bit of his collar, a little shine in his shoes, a few places like that. But that area of highest contrast is the area that is very interesting. And if we really crank up that contrast, we can see that we kind of lose a lot of the other information in the image. We kind of make out the buildings, especially if we already know what they are, and the railroad tracks, but we can really still see the guy standing there. And if we zoom way out, and I'm always encouraging people to do this, my scenic painters in a scene shop, walk away from the canvas, walk to the other side of the room and look at it. If you're painting digitally, scroll way out, zoom out from the image and see, does the composition still make sense, especially in terms of value and contrast. So in this little tiny picture up in the corner, we can completely understand this composition, even though it's many times smaller than the normal size. You might lose a lot of the other detail in the image, but the guy standing there at the side of the train tracks is still perfectly visible and it's still perfectly intelligible in the composition. Now, some other terms just to be aware of, you hear that term hard edge or chiaroscuro a lot. Hard edge lighting is what we're seeing in this photograph, and that usually means one directional, very strong light that's creating that high area of dark and light contrast, like we see right along this guy's forehead and nose there, where that side light is hitting his face. It creates a very dramatic effect, as it does here. It's used in photography and in live performance frequently, especially in dance, where we want to really reveal the form of the dancer. The term chiaroscuro, however, is just Italian for light and shadow, and that can also be graphical. So a painting that is done with just a grayscale, or something that's done in charcoal, where there's a real high contrast in the image, is oftentimes referred to as chiaroscuro, and that's a very dramatic way to show an image. So we can look at a photograph like this, which has been altered, and kind of get confused as to exactly what we're looking at. We've got this sort of big empty sky up here, and then a lot of this concrete down at the bottom, and this little ribbon of buildings to the middle. We're not really entirely sure where we're supposed to be looking until we turn the lights back on, what's the actual original photograph, and we see that, oh yeah, okay, that area of highest contrast, or the highest saturation, in this case, those yellow lights in that factory building there, really pull our eye to it and make it obvious what the focus and the subject of this image is. But without all those lights on there, when we turn off all those lights, we sort of lose the point of the image, and it just becomes kind of a strange landscape image. That all takes us to the term value, which is really essential, and hopefully you're all familiar with value as a term, simply the measure of light in relation to contrast. How bright is it? How intense is a particular light? And we get a really good view of that in this sketch, where we have this little L shape of low value along the sides and bottom there that really kind of frames the image. We've got this large block of mid-tone area that takes up a lot of the background, background, and then right there in the midground, this area of high value, right around where our people are and where those cars are. And if we zoom way out from here, we can see, again, it completely holds together. That little dark framing, in fact, it's even more clear when you zoom way out. We've got this now the strong dark frame, we've got that big puddle of light right in the middle, and then that sort of mid-tone background all across those buildings in the back. And that light level, the value separations there, hold together very well. We can also use color contrast. Eyes are drawn to the area of high saturation, as we've already discussed. Now, the jacket, the coat that this little girl is wearing here, is not all that concentrated, all that saturated. It's kind of a dusty old rose sort of low chroma red. And yet, compared to the black and white photograph that she's walking through here, it is the area of highest saturation, and our eye is drawn to that, as it obviously is intended to be in the film. And we have these highly contrasting or complementary colors that are very pleasing to us. So people drive hundreds of miles during the fall to go look at fall foliage and take photographs like this one, where we have a very pleasing complementary contrast of orange against a blue sky that really help clearly define that shape. And we can certainly see that our ability to see colors is a survival instinct. You might have seen the tiger in the black and white image, and good for you, you would have survived. But if you didn't, you could have been lunch. So moving on to balance. Balance is one of these big terms that I'm just going to give you a couple of terms right now because all the other ways that we create balance in a composition involve the things that we haven't gotten to yet. But balance has a couple of very simple forms. One of them is formal balance, and the focus is the focal point, the subject, is almost always at the center of the image. So here we have Jesus sitting at the Last Supper, and all of the lines of perspective are leading to him, and it's sort of equally balanced on either side, and he's absolutely in the center of this image. We can create balance through symmetry. So here's a beautiful photograph of a chateau, and we have symmetry in this. If we take and put an axis right down the middle of this, we have bilateral symmetry, and we like bilateral symmetry because we are bilaterally symmetrical. A human face, most animals in the world are bilaterally symmetrical, so you can draw a line right down the middle of us, and then the two sides are relatively symmetrical. Well, this has actually got more than one axis in it. If you see that the way that this photograph has been composed, there's actually quadrilateral symmetry going on. Because right there at the edge of the water, there's the reflection of the chateau in the water. Now, if that was all lawn down at the bottom, it would be an oddly composed image. We'd say, why is the chateau, why is the building way up at the top of the image with all this empty lawn? But here, putting the axis of the two symmetries right in the middle makes perfect sense because we can fold it from left to right, but we can also fold it from top to bottom, and we have quadrilateral symmetry in that. And there's another kind of symmetry to talk about, which is radial symmetry, which can be a little bit different than the others. Symmetry tends to create a kind of a static image or a very calm image, very stable. There's a lot of horizontals and vertical lines. Whereas with radial symmetry, we get all kinds of crazy diagonals and triangles. So radial symmetry usually involves one-point perspective, so all the lines leading to a vanishing point somewhere in the composition, as we see here. And then we can create all kinds of interesting effects with radial symmetry. So a sense of distance. So it feels like the street's going way back into the distance there because of the radial symmetry and the one-point perspective. A formal balance can evoke a sense of vastness. So we see, again, that same one-point perspective, big, empty, huge space where this carpet seems to be going way off into the distance. And we can create a sense of grandeur with one-point perspective. You know, that throne room or the main room of the temple or whatever, will frequently be perceived in a one-point perspective with radial symmetry. And it can also create a sense of inevitability. We see that all the time in films and games where it's like, this is the way you gotta go. Right in the center of your screen is your next step. Or even foreboding. This image, the little illustration, is really creepy. Not only the fact that there's a hand reaching out to touch a shadow down at the bottom, which is kind of cool, but all these lines leading to this house over here. Otherwise, it's a fairly simple image, but boy, does that look creepy, simply because of that radial symmetry or that one-point perspective that's sort of inevitably leading our eye to that house. It looks perfectly innocent, but something's up here. When some objects break from formal symmetry, it can add areas of interest. So we're looking at this little graphic design invitation here, and that Friday in the Friday night there has been kicked over about 20% or so. And as soon as we do that, suddenly look at it's all about diagonals and zigzags and triangles. If it was, the Friday night party all stacked up straight, we would have a very formal, very balanced. It would be all about the vertical axis through the middle of this. But because that one word has been tipped a few degrees out of whack, suddenly suddenly it's a Z. We start at the thou and we go down, slide down the Friday and come back to night and then party. And the whole thing seems much more zigzaggy, like a little marble maze, sliding down the image till we get down to the bottom, just because of that one 20-degree change. Suddenly there's all these triangles and all these diagonals, even though really only one element has been changed that way. Because of the framing elements, those little doodads that are below Friday become triangles, and it becomes much more exciting and dynamic just with that one slight change out of the formal symmetry. Let's move on to the last category in this first section, and that's shape. Again, one of these huge topics that we could really talk a long time about, but I'm just going to go through sort of the obvious bits. So shape is defined by edges, transitions in value, color, reflections, texture, etc. So this is a photograph of some sand dunes. 90% of the stuff in this photograph is the same material. It's all this sand. There's a little ribbon of sky and there's a few camels out there in the distance, but we have these wonderful shapes. Our eye can follow along all these little dune ridges there. And the reason why we can see those is because one half of the dune is being lit more than the other half of the dune. There are no black lines being painted out here on the desert. There's no sort of edges to this. It's a transition on the light. And that's how we perceive everything. If you walk into a room that's all painted white walls, white ceiling, you're not suddenly snowblind. You can perceive the different walls on the ceiling because of the different levels of light that are falling on those planes. We have no problem seeing that. And that's really how we walk through the three-dimensional world. We're not the world is not outlined in black lines. So if we were to take a look at this image, for example, this looks like this lady's like surfing this giant galactic surfboard in space or something. But if I said, draw this image, we would all pull out a piece of paper. And the very first thing we would do would be to take a pencil and draw that triangle out, right? We draw two lines that would define that shape because it's so dominant in this composition. And then we kind of sketch in where the lady was and then start adding in details. But remember, there is no line there along the edge of the light. There's darkness, and then there's where the sunlight starts. And in fact, you can even kind of see there's a little mid-tone section there, little fuzzy edge around that shape. But we are so accustomed to sort of using line to define spaces, and that's fine when we're laying out a sketch. We're just inevitably going to start by drawing circles and boxes and that kind of thing. But at some point we need to remember that unless you're doing something that's very graphical, like you're doing a cartoon or a graphic novel, sort of something that's going to be inked, that those black lines aren't really there. So if we look at this little sphere, it's not covered with black lines. It's the edges of it are defined by different light values. So we might get a little bit of ambient occlusion there down at the bottom where the sphere is sitting on the tabletop or whatever. It might get a little darker in there. And we get some edge on the contrast from the shaded side from the background. But then it gets a little fuzzy as we move into the lit side. And if we were to draw a nice clear black line, get out a Sharpie and draw a black line around the sphere, it would make the shape, the circle, much more clear, but we would really lose the sphericalness of the circle, and it would also obviously be very graphical, very artificial. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the shapes in our little balloon here. So obviously the balloon itself is dominating these images here. It's sort of big and red and it's an exciting shape, but there are other shapes in this image beyond this balloon. So for example, all along the balloon here, there are these little orange slice pieces of the ridges of the balloon that are leading our eye down to the fuel flame down at the bottom of the balloon. Those are sort of an interesting shape, a shape within a shape. And then, of course, there's the grass in the foreground. It's not just a little ribbon of grass along the bottom of a drawing like in a children's drawing. There's a big rectangle of grass there taking up the lower quarter of this image. And then there's a lot of horizontal lines. They're very subtle. There's some little horizontal lines in the clouds and little shadow lines in the grass that are sort of pleasingly horizontal. And then, of course, there is the space around the balloon itself. The balloon is not in any way touching the edge of the image, so there's no areas that are cut off from the whole horseshoe shape of sky there. So that in itself is a very powerful image as well. And that kind of leads us to a whole nother term, a whole other bunch of topics, and that is the idea of space around the positive space of an object. So here's a photograph that's very compelling, and it really is this sort of mirrored ribbon of the land that kind of swells up to this mountaintop and then down again. It's almost sort of a stroke of a brush of this landscape, and it is so compelling because the horizon line or the edge of the water is right through the middle of the image, and again we have that symmetry. We've got a symmetry going horizontally in this case that makes for a very pleasing image. And that all has to do with the terms positive and negative space and figure and ground. And I get a little pedantic about this because positive and negative space has an actual literal meaning that gets kind of blurred, and it's probably okay that it gets blurred, but just to define it clearly, Figure and ground is a term that means if I'm looking at a photograph of myself standing in front of a wall, I am the figure and the wall is the ground behind me, the background, if you want to think of it that way. Whereas in positive and negative space is a shape that is defined by the background. So in this clever little ad campaign here, there is no rabbit or cat or dog in these photographs. We get the impression of those shapes because of the negative space that is formed by the positive space of the people in this image. So here's a really good painting example of this. There's a wonderful framing element here of the negative space. Oftentimes negative space is sky, is background. So if we sort of look at that sky area and the shapes that is creating, it becomes a very interesting shape. It's a really good drawing aid as well. If you're trying to draw something from a model or from a photograph and you're just, I can't get this arm right, I'm not quite sure why this is not looking right. Well, look at the negative space. Oh yeah, the gap between her elbow and her side of her body is much bigger than I'm drawing it. It's much more of a triangle shape instead of this kind of flattened out shape that I'm drawing. So looking at negative space can be really helpful in terms of working out proportions in a sketch. But here's where I get a little particular about this, because negative space is not just empty space. This is particularly true in graphic design. If you put a word in the middle of the page, it's not negative space. The white paper is not really negative space. Negative space really implies some kind of form, some kind of shape that is defined by other elements in the composition. So in this photograph's case, really the only true negative space is the area between her elbow and her face and hat there, that little shape that is being created and surrounded by the positive space. And yet in this case, it's kind of hard not to talk about the negative space in this composition because she is sort of off to the one side and we have the big rectangle of the sky and the big rectangle of the beach. And that's kind of creating some shapes that aren't truly negative space, but they can oftentimes get referred that way, especially in photography. And then you get to the point where it's like, oh, like how can you not really see a white square? Because this shape here, even though it's just blank space, it really is a shape. So it isn't just like the white of the paper with some words on it or a picture kind of floating in the middle of a otherwise blank canvas. It actually is part of the composition here. So even though the only real negative space is kind of that little sliver between her back and the column there, in this case, it's almost impossible not to refer to the 2/3 of this image that are a white square as negative space because it is so dominant as part of the composition. But again, to be really literal, negative space is a shape that is created by positive space. So here's 3 good examples of that. This little beach photograph. Again, if that gap in the rocks wasn't there, this would just be kind of an oddly dull photograph of a rock wall and some sand. But because there is that little gap there where we can look out to the sea and the sky, it creates this very interesting shape. Almost looks like a big spoon stuck in the sand there, right? So that shape created by the gap is truly negative space. So don't confuse negative space just with blank space. Negative space actually needs to be part of the composition. M.C. Escher spent his entire lifetime playing around with the idea of positive and negative space and how we can be confused by that figure-ground relationship. What's the solid thing and what's the background behind that? But one more thing to talk about with this in terms of the empty space or negative space being an essential part of the composition can be seen really clearly in this image. So here this image, this horse is just like leaping into this picture. It's breaking the frame. There's a huge amount of space between the horse's body and the trees in the tent. That big gap there just makes this horse look like it's flying down a huge jump. Well, if we alter this picture to erase the ground there, the trees and the tent, then it just looks like a piece of clip art. It's like horse in space. It's just kind of floating there sort of statically. Whereas in the one on the right, if we move that ground way up to the horse, what actually kind of makes that gap, in this case, it actually is creating a true negative space where there wasn't one before. We have this little sawtooth pattern between the belly and the trees. So more traditional definition of negative space, but it doesn't work at all because it almost looks like the horse is moving like a carousel horse, kind of sideways from left to right into this image. It's much less exciting in the terms of the dynamics because of that gap has been closed so much. So that wraps it up for this first section. We're going to come back and talk about framing and layers and angles and some important things in the next recording. So see you then.